I'm Quechua, and I'm Mayo and Scottish. And sitting here in Venice in my home in occupied lands of Tongva, we thank them. And always praying for the ancestors here of this land and asking for guidance, for help, and for Creator to keep us healthy and to protect us from ourselves and others. And all these things unknown. I do want to touch real quick and lightly on the film, or Michael Moore's film, to say that we will be having a deeper discussion on that. And that's not what this call is about right now. However, that's why I'm weeping all day. I was devastated because of information, misinformation, or timeline. I'm going to keep it short. Basically, no environmentalist would ever be a proponent of oil extraction or cutting down trees. Even when they're poisoned and sick, trees should just be left to tumble where they are, you know, and then we can do something proper for that relative. However, going to this conversation now, it's an honor to have Marcos, because I was inspired by his words, hearing him on KPFK, specifically this topic, free, prior, and informed consent / consultation. I think it's important to have that consultation and consent. And moving forward into a new life, I'm hoping that we can somehow work together to make that true and to make it so. Without further ado, Marcos.
Nimislasoka Machilia, Lidia, Nitoka Marcos Aguilar, Niwalewa Mexico, Ashka Tikneki Mateshkaliwikan Titlatoske, Tomase Waligniwan Tongva, Kish, Gabrielino, Tataviam, Gabrielino, Wanshumash. I want to first recognize the peoples of this land in this territory that has been unceded and unconquered in a way. And recognize that we're here as their relatives and as guests on this land, and as indigenous peoples on this land. First, recognizing our advisors and our elders, Nick Rocha, son of Vera and Manuel Rocha, who helped defend many lands across the territories of their ancestors. And as young people, we joined with them in those struggles, from the sage fields to the Bayona wetlands to the hills of Pasadena to downtown LA, and learned from them the first lessons of the demand for free, prior, and informed consent, and also recognizing the important guidance of other elders like Jimmy Castillo and recent elders that have guided our youth, Gloria Arianes, and many others that from this territory have embraced not only our school as a community and ourselves as educators in struggle, but also our people as relatives. And I think that's still a conversation that is in development and ongoing as we seek to better understand how to exercise these rights that are now becoming recognized internationally. And as we seek to strengthen relationships among us as well that have been severed, but for many reasons for a long time. So I want to start with that and introduce also one of our students. Sion Aceves Rodriguez is here with us as well. Sion, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Tlakiltikin, no Yoliknin, no toka Zion, Niwalewa Mexico, no Temashiloa, Nitoka Anahuacalmecac. Good morning, everybody. I'm a student at Anahuacalmecac, and I'll be helping Tata Marcos with the free, prior, and informed consent meeting today.
Thank you. And Zion was one of our youth delegates in 2019, early 2019, seems like such a long time ago, to the last session of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. This year's session was canceled, obviously, as so many other things have been canceled. And so Zion has before that participated in multiple years of agency and advocacy as a student leader, and he's now our student council president as well and speaker. So I want to thank SoCal350 for organizing this, and this is the second time that Lydia's asked me to speak on free, prior, and informed consent, and I appreciate that, Lydia. I'm really honored to hear that anything I've said has inspired you, and particularly around these issues and my report back from our experience in Mexico in working on constitutional reform there, which was, you know, kind of larger than life for us to be a part of. I want to share some resources that are available online, you know, and I think it's in order to watch a short video, because I like making sure that we're not overlooking basic definitions and basic introductions that I think are always important. So I'll share a short video that's been made publicly available as a public resource, and then talk a little bit about the legal framework. I'm not an attorney, and obviously the intention of this talk, and I guess I should introduce a little bit about myself. So I'm the executive director of Semilla Sociedad Civil and a co-head of School of Anahuacalmecac International University Preparatory. Our school was founded 20 years ago in East Los Angeles as a parent and teacher collaboration to organize autonomous teaching and learning through Indigenous education. And since then and to this day, we're the only Indigenous peoples kinder to 12th grade school. We're the City of Los Angeles' first international baccalaureate world school, and are a part of a national Indigenous peoples resurgence network in education that we recently hosted a national convening of at our school. And so on many levels, and I would say fourth, we're also part of an international network of Nahuatl language revitalization called Tlayoltocanicniot. And we just held a national conference in Mexico in February regarding Nahuatl language revitalization in one of the last pueblos that speaks Nahuatl in the state of Mexico. So all that said, that the majority of our engagement with free, prior, and informed consent is in the context of education, both in terms of teaching our students and our community to exercise those rights, but also in the context of advocacy as educators, being cultural workers and community advocates, engaging directly with issues that impact the lives of the families that we serve and our own families as members of the human community. And I think it's also important to highlight that our participation and engagement in international concepts of Indigenous law is from a community-based level. You know, it's not from the level of the tribal government of a sovereign nation in treaty status with the United States. And it's not in the level of, I would say, even on a non-governmental organizational level. There are others that do that work. But I think that it's at the community-based level of struggle that we see the greatest advances in the application of Indigenous law, and in many ways in the advance of the environmentalist movement and the environmental movement in general, because it's the tents that were in the Mojave Desert protecting Ward Valley that engaged in that struggle directly many years ago, and it's the elders that were praying in the middle of the sage fields in Erewhonda that protected and prayed over those fields, and many times, you know, for whatever different reasons, the officials in positions of power in tribal governments have to engage in things differently or choose to engage in things differently, and so, you know, there has to be an open acknowledgement that grassroots advocacy, with or without legal counsel, is as important, if not more important, sometimes than the formal avenues. But when we talk about free, prior, and informed consent, we're talking about the relationship to state aid, to governments, to federal governments in the U.S. You know, would be with both the state level governments and the federal governments, and with their obligation to prevent the violation of the rights of indigenous peoples. And so with that in mind, we look to international law to try to resolve pre-existing rights and pre-existing legal frameworks, pre-existing to colonization. In a way, the whole thing is set up for conflict because it's impossible to actually engage in free, prior, and informed consent during and under colonization, under domination. The fact is that there was no recognition of our right to free, prior, and informed consent when Europeans invaded and settled the majority of the Western Hemisphere, or for that matter, anywhere else in the world. And so to do so after the fact is still a conflict, and it's still a contradiction in the legal framework. But nevertheless, there are legal precedents that began to recognize the rights of free, prior, and informed consent as an affirmation of self-determination, being the central right of collective self-determination, beginning with Convention 169 of the ILO, the International Labor Organization, the recognition of the fact that whenever consideration is being given to legislative or administrative measures which may affect indigenous peoples directly, or in this case minorities or tribal peoples, that such consultations shall be undertaken in good faith and in form appropriate to the circumstances with the objective of achieving agreement or consent. And dealing with that question of consent is really key. Is there a difference between consent and consultation? There was in 1992 a Convention on Biological Diversity, which expressly affirmed the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. There's another question: is this a right or is it a legal principle? And then, of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reaffirmed that right in a historic document that took basically 100 years almost to enact, of which the United States was not one of the first signers. It was actually one of the last holdouts to sign on to agreement with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The declaration, called UNDRIP or UNDRIP for short, includes no less than 7 provisions expressly recognizing the duty of states to secure free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous peoples in circumstances ranging from population relocation to the taking of cultural, intellectual, religious, and spiritual property, any damages, takings, or occupation or confiscation of the uses of indigenous peoples' lands, territories, or resources, and before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures, and prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, and other resources. And the UNDRIP elaborates on the application of that right as an extension of human rights that are affirmed collectively and extensively in treaties that have been ratified and signed by the majority of the states, in this case, the governments, world governments. And as such, the extent that the duties and the obligations as expressed therein in the UNDRIP are already binding on states, they merely need to look at the declaration to assist them in understanding how such rights might be protected for indigenous peoples as collectives, as nations, as well as their individual members. And that's obviously an ongoing tension within the United Nations body. Indigenous nations are not member states, and they have not been invited to become member states. So there's a difference in the correlation of politics in how indigenous peoples engage with as almost invited guests to the United Nations, and so that doesn't fully reaffirm or affirm sovereignty or self-determination or decolonization, which since 1965 the United Nations has called for the complete decolonization of the world. That hasn't happened. In 1965, there was also a call for an end to all forms of racial discrimination. And often we see the lack of free, prior, and informed consent as an extension of racial discrimination where it comes to questions of environmental justice, and in the context of the United States, with the context of how non-state actors engage in development is also critical, and that's both in terms of allies as well as non-state actors who seek to exploit. You know, in both contexts, Indigenous peoples raise the questions of free, prior, and informed consent. So with that in mind, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and share a real short video, just so it lays out some basic groundwork and is able to introduce at least one example dynamic of how it can be carried out, and pose some questions after that, and then I'll bring in Zion to discuss that with him. So let me, if I can.
I don't know anything about this logging.
Can you hear the audio?
No.
Tell you anything. This is not your land, and we are allowed to be here.
You got audio now?
Yeah.
Land? I think we need to educate you about what we now know about our rights. We are not ignorant, and we will not tolerate being pushed around. We have lived here for generations, and we can prove this. We have worked in these forests, which have given us shelter, food and water, medicines, and the spirits that guide and protect us. We have our own language, laws, and ways of doing things. We are recognized as Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous peoples have rights. Our way of life does no damage or leave a lasting mark on the land as your cities do, and we should be respected for that. But I've got permission from the government.
We have protection that is greater than a single government. There is a UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is recognized throughout the world.
Yes, as Indigenous peoples, we have rights to our lands, territories, and resources. This is our fundamental right, as our life, culture, and identity are dependent on our land. Leave and come back when you wish to do things properly and show respect for who we are. I must apologize for your last visitor. I told him not to come. I am here to say sorry and to offer you this gift to make up for any trouble. While I'm here, I would really like to talk about a project. We do not want your bribe. Whatever you give to us will be less than our cooperation is worth. It is an insult. If you have a project that affects us, or the land that we have the rights to, you must simply talk straight. We can work together using free, prior, and informed consent, which we will explain to you.
This is not a privilege. It is simply there to ensure that we are treated with respect. It is in our power to say yes or no. We are in charge of what
No audio.
Better electricity and clean water. I have a business plan I can show to you. Your business plan will mean little to us. We will ask you questions so we can understand in our own way. We want to improve our communities and work with people from the outside as long as they respect us and our rights. We will listen to what you have to say, but on our own terms, in our own way. Before we start, can I make a quick phone call? Boss, yes, it's me. Listen, I'm here at the village. No, they turned the money down. Unbelievable. This is not going to be simple. They know they cannot be pushed around. That's right. Free, prior, whatever that is. Yep, those days have gone. Okay, I'll keep you posted. Bye. Okay, so where do we start? The first thing you need to understand is what free, prior, and informed consent means. It is part of the declaration we told you about and is how we work with people from outside our community on anything that affects our lives.
It is simply a way to make sure we are not taken advantage of. We have our ways, and this helps us talk to those outside our world.
Free means any dealing we have will be free from fear or attempts to corrupt us, free to make our own decisions in our own way.
Prior is simple. We will always be told in advance about anything that may affect us. No one can just turn up and do something without an agreement.
Informed. We must be told of everything that you wish to do, but in ways that we understand. We have trusted partners who will work with us if we need, so be sure not to mislead us. We want to know the good and the bad, the present and the future of any project.
Consent. We will do nothing, decide on nothing, or agree to anything without the consent of those who live in our community. Your plans will only be allowed on our land if we as a community give our consent for it to happen. If we say no, then that decision should be respected.
Think carefully about how you want to change the land we love, about the benefits and problems it may bring before talking to us.
You should also learn about who we are. Someone wanted to build on land that is very sacred to our community. They did not bother to ask or find out about us. It did not take very long for us to say no to their project. Respect for people is a valuable and important thing. It is the basis of the way we live. We respect the forest, the world we live in, and each other.
You stole it! I found it eating all my corn. It's mine now. Stop. We can sort this out together using our own customary laws. Now you will learn something about the way we live. This buffalo broke through the fence and ate the food I was growing for my family. I didn't do it on purpose. It doesn't mean you can keep my buffalo. We will make a decision here and now that will be fair for you both.
Niran, you're responsible for looking after your buffalo, but you let it eat Kasem's crops and damage the fence. Raise your hands, those who agree with what was just said. So, it is agreed. You will return the buffalo, and you will provide food for the family to replace what was eaten. You will also repair the damage to the fence.
I think you should take them to the police to sort this out.
No need, we have sorted out the problem.
You can't just take the law into your own hands. The state decides.
Before states were formed, we already govern ourselves. We already had laws and ways of living that look after the interests and welfare of our people. These are the customary laws we live by. These rights are confirmed within the Declaration, our rights to self-government for internal and local affairs.
I can see that I'm not ready to talk to you about our project. Not if I want it to be accepted. If it's okay with you, we'll talk again in a few weeks.
All right, thanks for participating in that. Let me jump to another page here. And get some feedback from you. So let me share again. Okay, so can you all see this? So you can go to this web page here. I'm going to ask you for some feedback on this basic question: is free, prior, and informed consent a legal right or a principle? You can go to menti.com and use this code 937060. And we'll go to slide 2. So just reviewing, Zion, you want to go ahead and read the next few slides that come through and the definitions of free, prior, and informed consent?
Yeah. Free refers to a consent given voluntarily and absent of coercion, intimidation, or manipulation. 39. Free refers to a process that is self-directed by the community from whom consent is being sought, unencumbered by coercion, expectations, or timelines that are externally imposed. Prior means consent is sought sufficiently in advance of any authorized or commencement of activities. 40. Prior refers to a period of time in advance of an activity or process when consent should be sought, as well as the period between when consent is sought and when consent is given or withheld. Prior means at the early stages of a development or investment plan, not only when the need arises to obtain approval from the community. Informed refers mainly to the nature of the engagement and type of information that should be provided prior to seeking consent and also as part of ongoing consent process. Consent refers to the collective decision made by the rights holders and reaching through the customary decision-making process of the affected people or communities. Consent must be sought and granted or withheld according to the unique formal or informal political administrative dynamic of the community.
Thank you. So here's the question. Is free, prior, and informed consent a legal right or a legal principle? Based on the video, based on what we've discussed already, you can go to this menti.com 937060 and input your answer. Give us a few minutes for that. How many participants do we have, Jack, just to kind of keep track of this?
We have 11 participants, including you.
I can't respond. The gardener came through and was making too much noise. I couldn't hear, so I actually had to walk away. So I'll provide my answer at the end.
Zion, did you give your answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you for participating. Yeah, that's a good point that it's vague. That's the tricky thing about law, right? It depends is the typical answer. Seems to be a legal right because in video, business people could not do their project. Yeah. I would say it's a legal right. It's set down by the UN, but on an even more fundamental level, it represents anyone's right to have control over their own circumstances and decisions. And then legal right, people should be protected against oppressive systems. And then there's a question, legal right or principle? Legal right and principle, yeah, so both. And it is confusing. I think intentionally confusing because it's it's embedded in a confusing relationship, or at least a conflictive relationship. So thank you for your participation on that. I think that one of the explanations that I started off with the definition was that the international framework is not enforceable in a court of law per se. That the UNDRIP is not something you can go to court with and sue over, although it is tied to multiple levels of government law, whether it's hemispheric law, for example, with the Organization of American States and the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the treaties that particular treaty nations have in the United States. And in Mexico, in our particular experience, we had been recruited to participate in an open forum on constitutional reform to recognize indigenous rights in the Constitution of Mexico. And that included indigenous Mexicans who were in migrant status living in the United States, so exterior to Mexico. And so I participated in that local forum here in Los Angeles along with several leaders in our school, and was asked by the collective in that forum to participate as a delegate to the National Convention on the Constitutional Reform on Indigenous Rights in Mexico. What was key about that, and was intentionally confusing about that, was that the government kept referring to the process as a free, prior, and informed consultation. And the protocols of the meeting continued to highlight that it was a consultation and not a seeking of consent. And so it was intentionally confusing. Now, luckily nobody was murdered as a part of this process, and I say that in a very real way. There were very heated exchanges in the local community levels in the highlands in Mexico and in indigenous pueblos, and yet those were very real, large public meetings, sometimes involving up to 2,000 indigenous peoples, with people traveling for hours to get to the consultation meeting to meet regarding indigenous rights. And so we can't discount the fact that those were important meetings and that this was an important process to be actually reforming the constitution of the government. When do you think there will be a reformation to the Constitution of the United States to acknowledge indigenous peoples' rights? And by the way, it wasn't only indigenous peoples, it was recognizing the right to self-determination of Afro-Mexicans. And that was particularly called out, and it was done in concert with recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples. And so that was a powerful step forward in any way you look at it. And the process of meeting to discuss consultation and to be participating in that was a powerful process to gather indigenous peoples nationally the way we were gathered, with representatives of almost every single pueblo and definitely every language in Mexico, was important to address all the levels of rights. To address all the levels of rights that were addressed in the UNDRIP, from mineral rights to education to language to everything else, was an important exercise. But at the end of the day, it remained a consultation, because there was no process by which tribal governments or pueblo governments or sovereign autonomous pueblos or even indigenous organizations could actually say yes or no to the process. So with that, let me share another page here. So this is a handy little chart that's put it out by Cultural Survival, in terms of reaching a right to self-determination and a right to participation. One theoretically thinking, well, what can we do on our own and how do we want to do this ourselves? And the second being a right to participation in the dominant state society. And so we shouldn't be automatically excluded from it. We have a right to participate in it, but we have a right to determine how we want to participate in it. And so then there's a duty to consult, and what the goal of the consultation ought to be to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. So there's a little bit of a methodology to it that I think is useful in this chart. going on to our next. So given what we've learned so far, or at least heard so far, how would you explain on that same Mentimeter on the next slide, how would you explain free, prior, and informed consent in 1 or 2 words? I know that's difficult, but.
Anybody want to answer?
Well, you
But
can do it
sure.
on the Mentimeter,
Okay, there you go.
and then we'll see everybody's answers. Anybody having trouble with the Mentimeter? Okay, good. No answers up yet.
I answered in the chat.
Oh, in the chat? Okay.
I submitted my answers on the Mentimeter, but I'm not sure if did they not go through?
Let's see.
Yeah, same.
Let me try that.
Maybe we
Thank
should
you.
move to the chat.
Thank you, technology, not working.
Then let's place them in the chat.
Maybe you have to click hide image, but I can post in the chat.
Oh, that's a good idea. There you go. Brilliant. Thank you, Ethan. All right, Zion, you want to help us out and read these out?
Oh yeah. So I guess I'll start from the smallest ones. Right, collective rights, self-determination, empathetic discussion, honest legal idea, halfway justice, battleground, clear process, acknowledgement, compassion, communication, respect, and sovereignty.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I'll be sharing all these slides with you at SoCal350, okay? So you can hang on to them. That's good. I mean, it's essentially, we've got to be able to explain these processes at a community grassroots level. And so it's good for us to put these things into our own words and look for clarity. So, you know, a critical thing to us is how we embrace free, prior, and informed consent in our own actions, in our campaigns, in our movements. We still have the constitutional reform in Mexico that's still pending because of various factors, but COVID-19 now being one of them. The constitutional reform was actually never enacted or voted on by Congress in Mexico. So that's still pending for us. We're also, we've just initiated a process that's a campaign that we're calling a campaign for Indigenous Education Now. And we'll circulate information with that, and we would great to get allies from SoCal350 to support us. Title VI of federal education law requires that local school districts and state education agencies consult, and the actual word is consult, not consent, consult with Indian tribes, local Indian tribes and organizations. And that's been required since 2017, but LAUSD has never done that. And so the financial impact of that is now probably up to about $3 billion worth of federal funding that the district was supposed to consult with Indian tribes and organizations on, and they haven't. And so we filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint as a first step, and we're kicking off an Indigenous Education Now campaign with a large coalition of Indigenous peoples, including the Tataviam tribe, support from the Tongva, Gabrielino Council, Tribal Council, and other indigenous educators. The California Native Vote Project is leading up the campaign, and Semillas is one of the founders that of the coalition that called the issue to the attention of the American Indian community through the Native American Commission and others. And so that's an ongoing process where we're pushing the envelope from consultation towards free, prior, and informed consent. And that's on a local level, right? So we're going to be talking UNDRIP law, Organization of American States law, to LA Unified School District board members and to the superintendent. And so we have to make that parallel, and we have to draw those arguments based on, in this case, for example, federal law. Secondly is, or third, I would say, is the ongoing crisis in El Sereno, which is being organized as a community reclamation process with the reclaimers being 13 homeless advocates that are homeless themselves, that have taken over houses that are owned by the Caltrans state agency. For the past 60 years, Caltrans has been accumulating properties in this corridor called the Caltrans corridor that goes all the way from the end of the 710 freeway all the way north to, I think, La Cañada Flint Ridge, and definitely Pasadena. And so for 6 years, there's been legal battles that have stopped the freeway so far, but never really killed it until this past year, where the city lawsuits and the residents' lawsuits against the state finally ended that project. That's one part of 3 angles of attack against the community right now. That's on one side of El Sereno, is the Caltrans corridor, and the rights of homeless advocates there that have occupied 13 houses in that corridor that were vacant and have been vacant for decades probably, that are part of 200 different houses that are empty in that corridor right now. And so they've occupied them to both raise attention to homelessness, but also to raise attention to Caltrans's impact on our community. And we are raising the issue in a campaign that we're calling Nicantochan, which means this is our home, this is our community. And we're raising the rights of the waterways that sit beneath the properties in the Caltrans corridor, because there are natural springs still flowing. There's a natural arroyo that is still flowing, that we would like to see uplifted in that as a part of the urban wildlife. And it's interesting to me to hear others talking about. Thank you for working on the answer there on how we embrace the actions. Please go ahead and answer when you can. And so we're going to be uplifting a campaign to address the need for consultation and consent from indigenous tribes, but also a need for redress, and look for a way to address American Indian homelessness in particular, which is a crisis, by creating an indigenous peoples village, but also by creating a community center and space where the school can be a part of that reimagining of that land and that space, to continue to thrive and to be able to become sustainable. So those are the 3 campaigns that we're engaged in, aside from joining others in the climate strike and other ongoing environmental actions. But I'd be interested to hear from all of you now, and I hope that we've been able to share a little bit more about free, prior, and informed consent that may help in bringing these issues from being considered a radical demand to just understanding it as a minimum standard. And that's really important. And it's important for our community to understand that also, that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and with free, prior, and informed consent specifically, but also with all other rights acknowledged there, is not a radical demand for something that's out of this world. It's actually the minimum standard, not the ceiling, in terms of international law and in terms of what is just. It's the minimum standard. So we can always go higher. We can always demand more consultation. We can demand more equity and more justice. It doesn't mean that we are lost in that. But it also raises to the attention of our allies and of non-state actors the need to engage in this, I think, more directly, like this workshop. But even in terms of each of your campaigns that any one of you may be involved in, looking for a process by which to engage, at least in consultation with local indigenous tribes, and move beyond just simply land acknowledgement. I think land acknowledgement is one of those minimum standards that we have to move past. You know, land acknowledgement has to happen, it should be part of it, but it doesn't check all the boxes for us in terms of addressing indigenous issues. Until we all get a better grip of this, you know, it's going to be an ongoing process for us to be able to learn how to work with each other and address these issues, which may raise you know, contradictions on both sides. You know, because it's not that I'm not about to say that all indigenous peoples are engaging in sustainable, environmentally friendly practices. You know, even in the case of Standing Rock, there were major tribal government interests in fracking that are heavily invested in mineral extraction and oil extraction industries, and that's you know, fundamental to their economic model. So there may be points of contention that we have to address also, which again takes me back to the importance of grassroots organizers, who, even they were from those nations that are invested in extractive industries. At the grassroots level, there were members of those nations, tribal citizens, that are working against their nation being involved in extractive industries. And so that's important to remember. So at that, Lydia, I would turn it over to you, and I'd be glad to welcome any questions and invite any discussion.
Yes, thank you so much. Zion, I don't know, are you still there? Thank you so much, and thank you, Marcos. Let's open it up for questions.
There we go.
Hey, Jack, you can see everyone. Can you take stack if there's several questions?
Okay, yeah, if people know how to raise your hand, we'll do it that way.
So what, should I take it there are no questions?
There's a question.
I always forget how to do that hand raising thing, and
No problem.
but I've got my actual hand.
Go old school.
I'd love to hear your perspective. I know one thing that I try to be conscious of just in my organizing work is being very aware of people's capacities. And when we're talking about, free, prior, and informed consent, or when we're talking about sort of this philosophy of like nothing about us without us,
Right.
that's one conflict I've always had thinking about it is how do we balance that with the need of like respecting people's times and like knowing that like going to people constantly with things can be a burden in and of itself. So I wonder sort of what advice you might have in terms of how you think that sort of dynamic should be handled, and maybe guidelines that people might be able to use around sort of approaching that.
Yeah, I think that's challenging for me also, because we're also in the same position where we're challenged to reach out to elders constantly also for different angles of education or different campaigns that we're involved in. I think it's just an issue of more is better, engaging more is better, and allowing them to, tell us what their limits are, but also respecting that there are more than a handful of individuals, especially in a place like Los Angeles, that can be engaged and can engage. And I think there's also with this idea about NGOs and organizations like SoCal350, there could be a formalization of the process also, where you formally request consultation on a year's worth of campaigns in advance, to the extent that's possible, and formally address the tribal government of the local tribal governments or local organizations. The other thing is to recognize that they also have public meeting times. So just like you would have to attend a city council meeting and speak on in public comment period, you may request to speak in public comment period at the Gabrielino Tribal Council meeting, and respect that they have pre-organized times for us to do that as well. So I think recognizing formalities that exist is a good protocol, and I think for officializing the protocols of communication that you have with tribal agencies, Indian organizations, or Indian tribes, or tribal leaders or elders, I think is important also. You know, if you set your agenda in advance at a retreat, then, you know, let people know that much in advance as opposed to waiting to the same week or something.
Lydia's next.
I can go last.
Okay, Gia was after that.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I guess it just covers some of what I wanted to ask, but I was wondering if you have any examples in which free, prior, and informed consent was asked and how that worked out. What did it look like?
There are more examples now, in both in Canada and in Mexico. There was a recent Supreme Court case that struck down a law just 2 weeks ago in Mexico that was struck down by the Supreme Court of Mexico because consultation through free, prior, and informed consent was not obtained, and so I don't know that there are that many examples. You know, there was the case of one tribal council president who went to the United States Supreme Court in his traditional regalia, wearing his bonnet, his eagle feather bonnet, as obviously an expression of his authority and spiritual responsibilities. And he was actually ordered to take off the bonnet and not allowed into the Supreme Court with his eagle feather bonnet. And so he decided not to participate in the case. So even though the litigation took place and his attorneys or their legal counsel participated, it's interesting to see how even that kind of significant block is still put on those exercising our rights, even from the level of a federally recognized tribal chair. So there is no clear example where free, prior, and informed consent was enacted. And in Los Angeles County in particular, there's actually no policy on free, prior, and informed consent. There was Angela Mooney Darcy and Rudy Ortega from the Tataviam Nation and Angela from the Sacred Places Institute were engaged in talks with the county government regarding the rights of the river, of the LA River. And there was just simply no understanding of it. There was no practice of it. There was no way to even kind of connect, and there was a lot still to be done in terms of that at a local level. I would probably we are engaging in a study group ourselves with Betty Lyons from the American Indian Law Alliance, with Salomon Zavala of Olin Law, and other tribal leaders that we have relationships with, to do a more profound study of free, prior, and informed consent this next coming 2 weeks. And so one of the things that I'll make sure we ask for are examples of the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent, and that I could share with the group after that. But I mean, I think for the most part, what we see are processes of consultation.
Thank you.
Okay, Adolfo is next.
Thank you, Marcos, for your great talk, presentations, questions. I just, when thinking about free, prior, and informed consent, I feel like for some reason, I always feel that the other side always makes an economic argument to why property rights are important, an economic argument to why something like free, prior, informed consent won't be as good as like I mean, you've seen it in Brazil, for example, where there's been big arguments about oil versus the ocean. We're seeing it today in Mexico with like trains the Mayan train, or whatever I think AMLO's working on, versus actual land? And do you think that do you think that we need like a counter economic argument to this like economic argument out there that I think a lot of our own comrades in the left or whatever, like for workers and things like that, do you think we need a counter economic argument in order to really get free, prior, informed consent in just layman worldviews?
Yeah, I do, and I think that is. I'm sorry. Did you finish your question?
Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, and it's one the left has been struggling with for many years as well. You know, what is the left's proposal for humanity, and what is the environmental movement's proposal for humanity, and being able to clearly outline that is challenging. But I don't think that not having that in hand should stop us from engaging in identifying what's wrong and identifying what will harm us all. And certainly there are not only economic rights that are being uplifted as counters to free, prior, and informed consent, but also military issues are very quickly, these things become military. Whether it's mineral rights or whether it's the government's sovereignty over what they consider dependent nations and tribal governments, or the private interests of external investors, or the impact of global money from the World Bank and throughout the third world. So I think that there's not only an economic reality to contend with and counter propose, but also very quickly military ones. And that, you know, in many parts of the world, like in Mexico and other places, that and we saw in Standing Rock to some degree, that very quickly becomes the battleground, is a military battleground. And I think that that's most concerning, because it forces our children to be armed, right? It forces children in pueblos in Mexico to have to take up arms because their parents are being killed. And it has everything to do with control over the natural environment and the relationship to it. So so if the basic question is, should we have our counter proposal? I think yes, as Indigenous peoples, there have to be many counter proposals, because there are going to be many different levels to that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Austin is next.
Hi.
Hi, Austin.
Hi. Thank you so much for putting this on and for distributing it to all of us. I was wondering if there are resources when it comes to practicing this in our organizing spaces. There are resources that have outlined procedures and who to bring issues to and when these meetings are, just as a way to provide and distribute additional information to those that we organize with, in addition to more education like this.
Yeah, I can share some online resources, and would the best way to be to email Jack and Lydia to share those links? Yeah, and then and I think you know, towards what Angela Mooney Darcy had begun doing a couple of years ago with regards to the rights of the LA River, and her work in the Sacred Places Institute, one of the things that I think is going to be necessary is a sort of toolkit or handbook on how to implement this locally, both with allied organizations as well as in local government. And so that'll be one of the outcomes of our Indigenous Education Now Coalition, will be developing materials that can be applied on the ground, that can be resources here. You know, so what local city ordinances and state law can support free, prior, and informed consent, but also what kind of protocols can you implement as allies and even as grassroots Indigenous peoples, because we have to be mindful of the fact that, you know, we don't speak for our entire nation, and we don't speak for all Indigenous peoples as well.
Thank you for that. So I don't know if Madeline had a question. If she didn't, Lydia would be next.
Yeah, you know, in this time of COVID and the pandemic, I'm wondering if there is a specific kind of most urgent action during these times. Thank you so much for engaging us on this platform so we can still feel connected. But I do wonder kind of how this emerging pandemic is interacting with the work you're doing.
Well, we're centering on land issues that are immediately around us, which are, you know, pretty historic and pretty region-wide impactful, and so these become some of our priorities. But as a school, we're focusing on making sure our kids are well, that there's still learning and that they're continuing to engage in different experiences. And so part of expanding that through the Indigenous Now, the Indigenous Education Now campaign is part of where we see a priority, because we don't see that only as a question of including ethnic studies, for example, although we support that also. But we see that as the divvying up of billions and billions of dollars that we've seen over the last few weeks, divvied up across the United States, and in particular in California and in Los Angeles as well. That'll be happening. And so there has to be advocacy in terms of how the impact or benefit of those dollars, if they really are an urgent response to COVID-19 and the impact on our communities, should be included. But then we have to start developing this, re-strengthening our approaches to decolonize living in the time of pandemics, because it can't all be about prepackaged food being handed out to everybody, or, you know, giving everybody little $75 meal cards to go to the same grocery store that they didn't have access to before to buy their food. So I think it really does call the question, having a completely different way of life. And so the things that many of us have been thinking and talking about and organizing and practicing now make more sense to people. You know, to be able to make your food without gas or electricity. It makes sense even in Los Angeles, because that is more realistically going to happen. To be able to better source our food and monitor where the food is coming from and the quality of the food in terms of its healthfulness to our body, and to find cooperative collective solutions to that, to be able to find cooperative collective solutions to housing. I think, you know, Zion is on the Mayor's Council, Youth Council, and he's the head of that committee on housing. And before COVID-19, we were talking about an ordinance that he was studying as a part of that council that talked about some sort of rent abatement policy. And there was a goal to impact, you know, a certain number of people. And it was just really difficult to think about it being able to impact so many more people. And now we have the governor announcing 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people being housed temporarily in Motel 6s all of a sudden, overnight, almost. So I think that there ought to be, you know, all of you are engaged in all kinds of creative and in all kinds of creative actions and activity to defend human rights and to defend the environment, and that you should be proposing your more radical solutions and agendas, so that we can begin to think beyond what the current limitations are. I mean, it's crazy to hear Governor Cuomo now talking about what kind of sports they can sponsor, because people need something to watch while they're in quarantine. It becomes now the concern, you know, is, you know, what kind of gladiators are we going to feed to the lions now? So I'm in it with the same question as you, and we're trying to orient ourselves as well with big concepts and consistency in our culture and in our pedagogy and in our organizing, and I think that realignment is what we should be doing.
Thank you so much.
Lydia?
Yeah, save the troublemaker for last. You know, everyone at some point or another sent me messages, a lot of people, about the the Wampanoag tribe, the disestablishment, and what can we do? And I say write letters of support of the tribe and check out their social media, because, you know, for better, for worse, even Zoom, they're listening to us and watching and whatever. It's whatever. There was concern shared at our SoCal350 meeting about the disestablishment, and then also, you know, all these permits about the oil and everything that was going on with KXL, and then on top of that, there's COVID. So I decided to rewrite. I copied and pasted the Green New Deal, the congressional policy, and the California policy, and even the mayor's. No joke, or laugh if you will, I just copied and pasted punk rock style back in the 1980s style, and I did it myself. And I don't know, you know, how far reaching that's going to go or how serious it's going to be taken, because even grassroots organizers have referenced the congressional GND by saying, at least you're mentioned. And it was okay for us, for Indigenous people, to be mentioned on the last page, second paragraph to last. So I guess my question is, how can we, with policy and or even in the time of COVID, how can we, what's your one idea about that radical solution? And I'm gonna share mine. Mine is shut down the phone lines and crash their websites with emails and, you know, bombard them. But aside from, we can't get in our car, we can't drive around the Army Corps of Engineers, you know, downtown LA. It's ridiculous. So I'd like to hear if anybody on the line has other ideas of how do we center free, prior, informed consent and consultation. You know, would you support a rewrite of the GND? Because it's been done. More paper, more law. And my dogs agree.
I think that was a general question to everybody, right?
For you first, and then everybody else. Everybody else in the chat.
Yeah, I think that the search for economically sustainable exploitation is you know, it's inherently conflicted and contradictory. But to only be speaking in terms of utopia, I think, is also inherently contradictory. And I don't think there's any one solution to that. I mean, obviously, everybody can come up with an immediate solution, like you said earlier. Everybody's got to walk and use a candle, right? But I think that you know, even platforms like we're using right now, and as I look at with the students, you know, the concern now is, do all students have computers? And I'm looking at who's providing everything, and now it's Google, and Google is providing Chromebooks, and you know, it's just so crazily corporate and now so normalized and almost expected as a right. You know, it's my right to be assimilated and colonized. Is in many ways how it's coming out. I think with the Green New Deal, we should be able to counterpose, and I don't think I'm in a position to personally, as in terms of the work that we're doing ourselves in our community, but our youth certainly can counterpose and counterpropose the fundamental elements of our culture that are non-negotiables, and the fundamental elements of our humanity that are non-negotiables. And the exercise is to force the state to have to plan around that, as opposed to us trying to have to meet all their bells and whistles, you know. And I say that with full respect to an organization that's named after a degree, you know, 350, that is a technical approach to how we acknowledge the crisis, that's based on science, but also not falling into the mistake of responding to technocrats with technocrats logic as well, with technocratic logic, but really looking at original instructions. It's what our students ask every time we go before speaking around climate change is, what would our ancestors do? And how have our ancestors confronted crisis in the past? So at least in terms of our community and as Indigenous peoples, I think those still end up being the funds of knowledge that we have to tap into and more clearly lay out for our own generations, our future generations.
Thank you. I'm going to check the chat. I don't think nobody responded. I think that's the work for Movement Los Angeles for all of us to do, to break down those silos and to work better together in a unified way. And I can't thank you enough for giving us examples and best practices on how to engage local Indigenous people and to make sure that it isn't just a land acknowledgement and it isn't just a prayer. I'm going to say that I'm surprised that Manape and Sunrose didn't make it on the call. Next week, I do believe they want to jump in and talk about that as their treaty, tribal peoples, and they're actually sovereign. They denounced their American citizenship, and they are their own nation. There's 29 people and counting right now in the Sioux Nation tribal people. So they're trying to reach 200, I guess, to be eligible to attend the UN as their own nation now. So that's going to be an interesting talk, probably same time next Monday. So does everybody on the line know how to get in touch with the school? Can you drop in your information, Marcos, for a few of the new people to for your email and/or the best way to support the community, not charity, but solidarity? And that way, in a good way, we can continue this dialogue and definitely centering the local tribal people of Los Angeles, of this Yagna. And I don't know, Jack, you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I think just how Lydia started talking about such things as this planet of the humans type of mentality and the assertion of technocratic means of dealing with a scientific problem. We understand that there's a bringing together of communities, of voices, and really building, I mean, at heart of what free, prior, and informed consent is regarding, and it gets to, if you have a solution to the climate problem and you want to turn land into a massive solar field, there are situations where that might be something that should be undertaken, but getting that free, prior, and informed consent from the people of that land, and then making sure that that is even a sensible way to move forward. I think what we're working on more community-based solutions that come from the community, that are led by frontline communities that would include Indigenous, but also extend to people on the front lines of fossil fuel issues and the many other issues that we're dealing with. And, to be careful at the science and the scientific aspects of what 350 parts per million in the climate. I mean, that's a really important number, but we've blown way past that. We will never replace that with another solar energy plant. But we also do have to decarbonize and repurpose, particularly in such a massive city that we live in. And there are compromises that happen all the time. And a lot of times the victims, in addition to Indigenous people and frontline communities, there are also environmentalists who are advocating, and they get sort of pushed by these neoliberal green capitalist solutions that are packaged and greenwashed and put out into the world as clean energy, as renewable energy. And that's a very pernicious thing that we also have to be aware of and fight against. And because false solutions get us, a couple times you might go up the next step, but we have a giant mountain to climb to solve this problem. And so a lot of times we have to be aware and listen to people and have solutions come from the people in the communities first. So I really appreciate, Marcos, you coming out today and in this virtual way, and I'm hoping we can figure out to get this video out to more people and continue the discussion. So whether we're going to continue to have Monday meetings, is it going to be weekly? We'll be in touch with people, and we'll create a little list and try and continue the discussions, because I think it's really important. Does anyone else have anything to add? Okay.
Well, I'll just thank you all again for inviting us, and thank you, Zion, for joining us as well. Lydia, for keeping us in mind, and Jack, we've always been impressed by your work, and we're impressed by your leadership as allies, and so at least with SoCal350, know that you count on an ally with us in Anahuacalmecac.
Thank you.
I'm going to say a short prayer. Creator and Tongva ancestors, please help us continue to let go in our grieving of an old life, and that we move towards a very healthier new future, a shared future for all life. Creator, we ask that you bless every single one on this call and everyone who couldn't be on the call, and those that support us in our endeavors. We're asking in a good way with humble hearts that we stay in unity, and that we stay with a good word and a kind heart, and we show compassion, and that we are gentle, strong with anything that we do together in volunteering and working during these difficult times. We ask that you protect us and that you keep us in good health.
Yeah.
Aho, matakuyasan.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
I just got
everyone.
lava and Bron.
Who's that?
Hey, okay, so I'm so sorry that I wasn't here earlier. I'm here now.
Flower.
I know what time it is, and I just get off the phone with Nikki, and I'm gonna see if we can start getting our Pacific Islander sister to show up to these meetings. Hey.
Great.
Well,
much love to you.
I'll make sure I show up on time next time.
All right. Don't cheat us. We'd rather have you owe us than cheat us out of it. All right. Much love to everyone.
Everybody, thank you.
Thank you.